Blog Talk Radio.
Alternative facts.
The following message is transmitted at the request of the United States government. At 12:07 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, numerous unidentified objects of unknown intent and unknown origin were detected at high altitudes over multiple locations of Earth's outer space by the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, and these objects are presumed to be some form of controlled aircraft. It is not known if more of these aircraft will arrive, or if they will attempt entering Earth's atmosphere. United States citizens are encouraged to monitor local media outlets, as more updates will follow as information becomes available. The following message is transmitted at the request of the United States government. Attacks by the undead have been reported in several states across the country. The dead are rising from their graves and are attacking the human race. At this time, it is expected that more attacks of this nature will occur in several other states in the next few hours. The intent behind their attack is unknown at this time. He has been observed that a byte or exchange of fluids is a method of transmission. This is an extremely dangerous situation if they crave the taste of human flesh. It is not known whether this event will last for hours, days, or even longer. Stay calm, as authorities have been dispatched to deal with these creatures. An all-clear siren will be sounded when this situation is under control. Pacific Standard Time, NORAD detected a long-range nuclear missile launch. This missile is believed to be headed in the direction of all residents within a 400-mile radius of this area should seek a fallout shelter immediately.
Welcome to Within the Chaos with your host, Rodney the Viking Shortridge, co-host, Melinda the Raven Jackson. Want to give a big old shout out to the Facebook paranormal groups that allow us to post our shows on their pages and helping us to get the word out about all of our guests. Also, a shout out to the Connor sisters. Hats off to Misty and Ashley. They are the founders of SOS Sisters of Salem Paranormal Research Society and host of their podcast, Paranormal Party. You can find them on Facebook under Paranormal Party. If anyone would like to speak to Black Diamond Paranormal Society, BDPS, to discuss your paranormal questions or issues, go to our website at blackdiamondps.org or email blackdiamondps@yahoo.com. As always, our services are free.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. You can listen in by calling 516-387-1922, or you can go to the Vibe Radio Network website at blogtalkradio.com/Vibe Radio Network. For deep within the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for listening to Within the Chaos. My name is Rodney Shortridge, and I'll be your host tonight. along with my beautiful Raven, Melinda Jackson. First off, I'd like to give a shout out to my cousins up in Ohio, Jennifer and Joe Shortridge of 222 Paranormal. If you get a chance, check out their talk show. You can find them on Facebook under 222 Paranormal.
Have your devices just randomly stopped working? Are you having IT trouble? Not to worry, Mead's PC Repair Shop can help. We also offer IT support too, including website hosting. We are now also offering full event management services. To find out more, contact our friendly customer service team who will gladly help in any situation. Just call 276-880-8900, or if you prefer, you can stop by our shop at 1089 St. Clair Street, Oakwood, Virginia, 24631 by appointment only, or by visiting the website at meadspcshop.com for more information. Thank you.
Well, tonight our special guest is Graham Phillips. Graham is Britain's best-selling nonfiction author. He's also a radio journalist and broadcaster for the BBC. Let's hope everything goes good tonight. Melinda's not with us tonight. She's feeling a little ill, so I'll be flying solo, which is no problem. I've done it before, and we can do it again. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and see if I can get Mr. Phillips on the phone here, or see if he's on. Hello, Mr. Phillips, are you there?
I am indeed. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I cannot believe it. It's fixed.
It's working.
It's working. Sometimes it don't want to work.
All this modern technology.
Oh, I know. It's great sometimes, and then other times I'm sitting here pulling what little hair I have out. Well, Mr. Phillips, we'll start out by you telling us a little bit about yourself and what started you on the path of becoming a writer of so many different such as your legends, historical events, and conspiracies.
Well, I started investigating both historical mysteries and the paranormal back in 1979. I mean, we're going back almost half a century. And I was an editor of a magazine called Strange Phenomena, which, you can tell by its title, investigated unusual, unsolved mysteries. And one of the mysteries that we investigated concerned this old Elizabethan manor house in the centre of England that had a series of paintings on the walls which were said to hold clues to the whereabouts of a hidden treasure. And the hidden treasure was said to have been this green gemstone that was once set into the ring of the Queen, Mary Queen of Scots, who lived in the 1500s. And the story went that this stone was held miraculous supernatural properties, and if the owner had it, they could gain all sorts of strange paranormal abilities and powers. So, I didn't at that time believe that the stone had any particular supernatural element about it, but I did believe that it was an historical artifact that had been hidden around the year 1600, and tried to solve these clues in this painting on the walls of this old Elizabethan manor to see if I could discover where it was. And cutting a long story short, when the clues were deciphered, we discovered in this old mound not far from the house this brass casket buried in the ground, and inside was this small green gemstone, a sort of thing you'd have set in a ring. We took the casket and the stone to a museum, and it was dated to the right period, around 1600. That's when the thing had been buried, The stone they couldn't date, but it could very well have belonged to Mary Queen of Scots. Somebody certainly, hundreds of years ago, back in 1600, had actually gone to the trouble to leave all these clues as to where it was. And it was fascinating. It was my first exploit as a real-life Indiana Jones, so to speak. And that's what got me hooked on investigating unsolved mysteries.
Wow. That sounds like that just to be able to find it from the clues, that would be amazing. But with so many books that you have written, such as The Lost Tomb of King Arthur and The Search of Camelot and The Isle of Avalon and Merlin, I thought maybe tonight, if you'd like, we could discuss more about King Arthur and, whether he was real or not and how the legend of Arthur began.
Yeah, that would be absolutely brilliant.
Okay.
The story of King Arthur, as it's portrayed today, began during the Middle Ages, around about the year 1200, when a number of romantic tales were written, collectively called the Arthurian romances, in which Arthur is portrayed as this knight in shining armor. He lives in a huge Gothic castle. He rescues damsels in distress and fights dragons. He has this round table at his capital of Camelot, where all these knights sit, and they go off on various quests, such as the search for the Holy Grail. All these tales are written down around about 1200. Now, in my way of looking at things, I wasn't trying to discover the Arthur that matched that profile, because that was clearly a fictitious invention. These were novels, if you like, of the Middle Ages. But what was fascinating is that hundreds of years before these tales were written, there are historical records concerning a man called Arthur who lived around about the year 500 AD, and he was one of the last people in Britain to organize a defense against the invading Anglo-Saxons. Now, Britain had been part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had collapsed in the 400s, and the Anglo-Saxons, who came from what's now Germany and southern Denmark, began to invade Britain. And Arthur is said to have been one of the last people to make a successful stance against these invaders. And these historical documents that still exist in places like the British Library in London say that Arthur was an historical figure, but they don't associate him with dragons and damsels in distress and all that sort of thing. They portray him as a real down-to-earth historical character. And it was this Arthur that I decided to go in search of.
Okay. So the author that has been written about, the legend, who wrote that legend?
Well, the original stories that were written about the romantic Arthur were written by a whole series of different writers. The first one was a man called Geoffrey of Monmouth from England, who wrote, he came from Wales actually, part of Britain, and he wrote the first Arthurian romances around about the year 1135, but the majority were written between around about 1190 and 1220 by various different authors. The earlier historical information, one particular writing was by a British monk named Nennius, who wrote about the year 800 AD. But this was obviously about 300 years after the time Arthur is said to have existed. But Nennius took a lot of his writings from monastic records that had survived, And the time he was writing was called the Dark Ages because Britain had fallen into a state of anarchy following the collapse of the Roman Empire. So you haven't got all that many records to go from because they were all destroyed in the during the Dark Ages. But he describes a series of battles that Arthur fought. He describes that he was very successful in defeating the Anglo-Saxons. In fact, he is portrayed as one of the last of the Romans. The Roman Empire had collapsed throughout Europe, Britain being an island. Roman civilization hung on here for about 100 years after it had collapsed elsewhere. So around the year 500, you've got this struggle of the last vestiges of Roman civilization existing in Britain. And Arthur is said to have been the leader of these people. So in a sense, he was like the last of the Roman emperors. And to try and discover who he was, and if he really existed and what he actually did in real life, my first quest really was to try and discover, was there an historical Camelot and where was it?
Well, was the Roman author or the legend author, did either one of them become king of Britain?
Yeah, it was a bit more complicated than that. When the Roman Empire collapsed, Britain divided into a series of separate kingdoms, and the Anglo-Saxons invaded the east of Britain. Now, the capital of Roman Britain was London, or Londinium as the Romans called it. That had been invaded by the Anglo-Saxons. So the center of resistance couldn't have been there. There had to be another capital city in the country of the time. And this was a place called Viraconium, which is in the modern county of Shropshire, in the center of England. And archaeologists have excavated the remains of this city. It now is just ruined walls in open farmland just outside a small village called Wroxeter. And at Viraconium, archaeologists had discovered that whereas many other Roman towns in Britain were being abandoned for more easily defendable hill fortifications and civilization was collapsing, at Viraconium, the opposite was taking place. Not only was it still a thriving city, it was massively refortified, and at the center of it, there was built a lavish Roman-style villa, a palace, if you like. And the archaeologists determined that this was the seat of an extremely important warrior chieftain or warlord of that area, and seems to have been the only person in the country capable of mounting a successful defense against the invaders. So I decided, okay, if an historical Arthur existed, then around the year 500, when he is said to have lived, the only place that he could really have had as his seat of power was this old Roman city of Viraconium. Now you might think, well, that's not called Camelot, is it? Well, unfortunately, there's no point in looking for a place called Camelot. Firstly, nowhere by that name any longer exists, or there's no record of it either. The word Camelot was an invention of a French poet by the name of Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote about 1190, and he wrote a poem about King Arthur, and he needed a word to rhyme with Lancelot, hence Camelot. Before this time, Arthur is always said to have ruled from a magnificent city, but its name was never given. So Viraconium or anywhere else, as far as the name's concerned, could actually have been the historical Arthur's city. But as it was the capital of post-Roman Britain around 500, that is the place that I decided to concentrate my search for an historical Arthur.
Okay. Well, what about the story of the sword and the stone? Is that a legend or is that based on any fact?
It's an interesting point, the sword and the stone, because in the story, Arthur is said to draw a sword from a stone that no one else can pull out, and when he does so, he proves that he is the rightful king of Britain. Now, what's interesting about this is that many people assume that the sword in the stone is one and the same as the magic sword Excalibur, but it's a different one. Arthur actually has two swords. He pulls the sword from a stone to prove that he's king, and Excalibur is given to him later by a mysterious water nymph called the Lady of the Lake. That's the magical sword that he wields, and it is said that if he has Excalibur, he's invincible in battle. But the original sword he pulls from the stone, it's a weird idea, pulling a sword from the stone. But it may be that that particular tale is due to a mistranslation. In Latin, the name for a large stone or detached fragment of rock is Saxon, which is a very similar word to Saxon. So it's possible that when the earliest writers of Arthurian tradition, who wrote in Latin, referred to Arthur taking the sword from the Saxum, in other words, the sword from the sword from a stone, it could have been confused with the original wording, which was taking the sword from the Saxons. In other words, the people he was fighting, he took the sword from the Saxons, he took the fight away from them. In other words, it's a lyrical way of saying he beat the enemy. And this could have evolved into the story of a sword and stone as years went by. However, there is, in London, near St. Paul's Cathedral, in the centre of London, there is a stone which is said to be the one that Arthur drew the sword from. It's fascinating because it's stuck in the wall of a building which I believe now is a bank. You literally go down this street and there's this grill in the wall, this iron railings, and behind it is this stone which is about 3 feet across and 2 or 3 feet high, which is actually said to be the very stone Arthur pulled the sword from. So if you're looking at the legendary side, you can go to a place called Cannon Street in London and see that one in the wall beside the sidewalk, or you can say, well, maybe it's a mistranslation of Arthur defeating the Saxons.
Well, I've read that historians believe that the reference to Arthur, was actually a way of honoring the myth of the Celtic bear deity with a similar name. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, that's a very good point. One of the reasons I believe that until my research, no one had really been able to home in onto who Arthur was, is that it seems that Arthur may not have actually been his real name, hence you wouldn't have found him in the records, but a title. Now, many Celtic warriors of the period were given honorific battle names or titles named after an animal or a mythical beast, best representing their prowess. For example, if you were cunning, you might be called the fox. Now, in the case of Arthur, the name actually means in ancient Brythonic, which became modern Welsh, the language spoken by the Britons at the time, the word for a bear is Arth, and Arthur means the bear. So it could be, like many other Celtic warriors, that Arthur was a title he held called, so therefore he was actually known as the Bear. The question then is, what was his real name? And is there any historical record near the time he's said to have lived about an important warrior called the Bear? And there is. A monk named Gildas, whose writings still survive in the British Library in London. He was writing in the year 545, within living memory of the events surrounding the period Arthur is said to have lived. And he refers to a specific king as Ursus. Now, he was writing in Latin. If you translate Ursus from Latin into English, you get the bear, a bear, Ursus. So he does mention a warrior called the bear. And when you look into the genealogies, which is the family trees that still survive from the Dark Ages about who ruled where, when, and how, the name of this person he refers to as the bear ruled from the city of Viraconium, one and the same place that I'd already identified as a possibility for Camelot. In other words, the capital city of Britain at the time. So you've got all these things beginning to tie together. Arthur is said to have ruled around 500 AD from the most powerful city in the country. The most powerful city in the country from archaeological perspective, around 500 AD, is this city of Viraconium, and Viraconium was ruled by a man called the Bear, or in Brythonic, Arthur. So I'd pretty much tied him down.
Wow, that's fascinating. What, by any chance, do you know how many battles that Arthur was involved in, and how many was slain by his own hand? Or is there any records of that?
Yeah, this monk Nennius I mentioned earlier, who wrote a pretty matter-of-fact history about Arthur. He doesn't say much. During the Dark Ages, ink was in very scarce supply. I mean, since there was no longer a manufacturing industry as there had been in Roman times, it was hard to get hold of ink. You had to make your own. And most of the time you made ink which was no good, and it later faded. Paper, believe it or not, was a scarce commodity. There was nobody making it, so people were having to write on parchment or animal hide. So that's another reason there were very few historical records of the Dark Ages. The interesting thing is that because of the scarcity of writing materials, people tended to write very concisely. So when I say that Nennius wrote quite a lot about Arthur, it probably comes down to a page in modern writing. Now, what he does tell us, though, is he lists 12 battles in which Arthur was successful, and another manuscript of around about the same time, known as the Welsh Annals, also in the library in London at the British Library, that describes Arthur's last battle, which is called the Battle of Camlan. And in that battle, Arthur dies. And that is somewhere, it depends how, the dating they use in these old manuscripts is a bit different today, but he dies somewhere around 530 AD. Now, where was the Battle of Camlan? Well, my research suggests that it was over a river now called the Camlad, which is not very far from Viraconium, this capital city. And I was trying to think, well, is there any records of this battle? Knowing that Arthur was not the actual real name of the person I was looking for as being the warrior behind the legend, I looked through these genealogies, family trees, and discovered that the person who actually ruled from Viraconium in 500 AD was a man by the name of Owen Thangwyn. Now, Owen Thangwyn is this one and the same person that this monk Gildas refers to as the bear, hence Arthur. He lives 500 AD. Owen Thangwyn may be the historical Arthur. He dies, and the records show that he died on this battle that was fought at a ford, a river crossing, on the river Camlad, which may have given rise to the name Camlan. But what's even more incredible, we're even told where he was buried. And that was my ultimate search for King Arthur.
Well, what has surprised you in your research for Arthur?
My intention was ultimately to discover his grave if he existed. The book I wrote was called The Lost Tomb of King Arthur. And I think tomb probably is an overstatement. It's not so much of a tomb, but a burial in the ground. Although the legends say he's buried in the tomb. It was the Dark Ages. Nobody had the whereabouts or could afford to build lavish tombs in those days. But the way I found where this man, Owain Thangwyn, was buried, the man who bore the title, the Bear Arthur, is by an old war poem. When warriors died in Celtic times, what happened is that they would be, somebody would compose a poem or eulogy concerning their exploits. And in a poem written by one of the members of court, we're told that after Owain died, he was buried at a place called the Churches of Bassa. Now, just a few miles away from Viraconium, there is a village still today called Bath Church. Bath Church, Churches of Bassa, it had to be the same place. And just outside the modern village, there's this big mound that was once surrounded completely by water, but much of that has dried up, but you've got a large lake there. And this mound, archaeologists had determined, was a burial site for the kings that had ruled from Viraconium. And this poem tells us pretty much exactly whereabouts in this area, this hillock, which is known now as the Berth, which comes from Old British, meaning simply burial site. And there was a particular location where Owain was buried. So I thought, is this poem accurate? Is there somebody still buried down there? So I managed to persuade archaeologists, the county archaeologists, plus scientists, a team of geophysics experts who use equipment such as ground-penetrating radar to see what's hidden underneath the surface of the soil without having to dig down, to do an exploratory survey of that area. And they discovered on the computer-generated image that the ground-penetrating radar had created that exactly at the place that Owain was said to have been buried, there was a circular grave under the ground, and it contained what appeared to be the skeleton of a human, and upon its arm was a shield, or the remains of a shield. And this is exactly how warriors were buried at the time in question. So there's no doubt that I'd found the grave of Owain Thangwyn. It was still there, it was still undisturbed. And if Owain was Arthur, we certainly know he was called the Bear, which would have been Arthur in Brythonic. Then this, in this little field outside a village in central England, was where the historical Arthur was finally laid to rest.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, does any of your research or any of the legends tell of Arthur's parents and who they were?
Yes. Now, this is fascinating because if it's not enough proof that Owain Thangwyn was Arthur, the fact that he came from this city that matches in other words, it's the most powerful city in the country where Arthur must have come from had he existed. And his name is Arthur. His father was called, according to these genealogies that survive at the British Library, his father was named Anion Gert, which means something like Anion was his name. Gert basically means the indestructible. So that was his title, if you like, but it wasn't his only title. Like his son, he also had a battle name, this tradition of giving somebody the name of an animal or mythical creature. And in his case, he was known as the Dragon. Now, people might think, well, how did Britons know of dragons? Surely they were a Chinese thing. Yes, but they were also a Roman thing. And the Romans, who probably got the idea of the dragon by distant trading with China, often had dragons on their depicted on their shields or as emblems for various legions or regiments of Roman soldiers. So people in Britain in 500 were well aware of the mythical beast, the dragon. And this is what Owen's father, Enion, was actually called. His battle name was the Dragon. But he was known as more than that. The various writings concerning him, which are scanty, but they do tell us that he was known in English as the Terrible Head Dragon, as in the Mighty, which fits in with his second name, Gert, which means invincible. So it's called the Terrible Head Dragon. Now, if you translate that back into Brythonic, the language spoken in Britain at the time, the Terrible Head Dragon translates into Uther Pen Dragon. And in all the Arthurian romances of the Middle Ages, Arthur's father is known as Uther Pen Dragon. So I think you can pretty much say that nails the fact that I have located who Arthur really was and where he was buried.
Wow. Well, with what I've read about Merlin, I've read different things about him being a shapeshifter, a statesman, a magician. So who and what was Merlin?
Well, you would imagine that Merlin was one of the more unlikely characters to have been really associated with Arthur. I mean, there's plenty of characters in the story who were clearly made up. It seems Lancelot was already a French mythical hero before the writers of the Middle Ages interpolated him into the stories of Arthur. Merlin, it's not the same case. The Welsh annals that I mentioned earlier, that are early records of various things happening in Britain during the Dark Ages, refer to a man who did live in the 500s by the name of Merlin. Now, once again, a lot of the problems have come identifying people from this period by all these different names they used, especially being given honorific names of animals. And Merlin is actually the name of a small bird of prey today. Back in Brythonic, a merlin was a name for an eagle. So Merlin simply means the eagle. It's not the man's real name. But in the oldest references to Merlin, he's referred to as Ambrosius. And historical records preserved from Britain, some of the very few records preserved from Britain from the late 400s, tell that there was a warrior by the name of Ambrosius Aurelius who united the Britons to fight off the Anglo-Saxons just before Arthur took over the job. This man appears to have been wounded or grew old and then took over as an advisor to the successor, Arthur. And this man, Ambrosius, he really existed. There's no doubt about this. There's Roman records of him too. His surname, Aurelius, shows that he was descended from the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He's the good emperor at the beginning of the film The Gladiator, the one played by Richard Harris. So he was a definite high-ranking Roman citizen who ended up in Britain when the empire collapsed, helped fight off invaders here, retired or was wounded, then becomes an advisor to the next leader of the Britons, Arthur, and evidently became something of a recluse and then took up religion, but not the Catholic, Roman Catholic religion, but the religion of the Celts, and he became what was known as a bard or druid. And these people were accredited with gifts of prophecy and the ability to heal. And so there is a real figure called Ambrosius who was attributed with the gift of prophecy and other magical powers, who advised Arthur, and he had a title, the Eagle, which in Brythonic is Merlin. So whether or not he could do all this shape-shifting and get people to control people's minds or whatever else he was supposed to do, well, that's open to question. But it's clear that people attributed him with these powers. And so, yes, Merlin did exist.
Wow. Well, this kind of goes off topic, but my name, I got my name from my dad, and it's spelled with a V, not an M, and I'm called Verlin. Now, I've been told that is from, Merlin. Is that true or not?
How do you spell your name again, please?
It's Verlin.
Yes. In Brythonic, the actual word for Merlin would be pronounced something like... We know this because the Romans used to produced dictionaries, if you like, of how to actually say foreign words like Gaelic words, Germanic words, and so forth in their native tongue. They didn't. They had the alphabet we do now. Our alphabet came from the Romans, and there were certain sounds in Brythonic, like the th sound, or that they had no symbol for. The Romans didn't have a letter for the th sound, as in the. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, they still didn't have one, and they created a character that looks like a letter Y. So you often have people reading old manuscripts thinking that people spoke ye olde English. They didn't. It was always the. There was never such a thing as ye. It was just that this letter that was supposed to be pronounced as a th looked like a Y. Now, coming back to this B and M confusion, the word Merlin would have been pronounced something like Feridun, Feneridun. Now, how on earth do you write that in Latin letters? So some people wrote Merlin with a B, some people wrote it with an M, and some people wrote it with a new letter they'd made up that seemed to sound more like the original Celtic pronunciation of that letter. So the answer is yes, it could be Merlin.
Wow. I grew up always wondering that, and had a couple history teachers that told me that, and it just astonished me, especially being where I live and in the middle of the mountains and woods, for that name to actually be around in this area. It just shocks me.
Well, yeah, I mean, trace your ancestor right back, and goodness knows who you'll find. But there seems to have been more than one Merlin, because it was a title meaning the eagle. A succession of druids during the 500s inherited this name, the eagle, Merlin. They weren't all from the same family, so you'd have to find out. I would say that if your name does come from something that goes back in your family history, and it does go back to one of these druids or bards of the the 500s, then you've got a 1 in 3 chance of being related to the one that was associated with Arthur.
Wow, that's kind of amazing. And strange at the same time. Well, who was Guinevere? And was she a real person? And did she was it legend that she betrayed, Arthur, or is that just the romantic side of it?
I think that's probably just the romantic side of it, because remember I said that Lancelot seems to have been a mythical person in French legend before he ever became associated with the Arthurian story. It's kind of like, like today when you get these Marvel comic or DC comic TV series. They start off with it's all about Green Arrow, or it's all about Batman or whatever, and then suddenly you get everybody else coming into it, Wonder Woman and Green Lantern and the Flash and everything. They keep adding all these on, but at least they were all invented by one group of people. But back in the Middle Ages, if you want to make a King Arthur story popular in France, what better way of doing it than bringing one of their own French heroes? So Lancelot's brought into the story for that reason. So the likelihood of Guinevere having an affair with Lancelot is, well, obviously that's made up. Now, did she have an affair with somebody? Who knows? But it's probable that Guinevere wasn't the name of Arthur's wife at all, whoever his queen was, because not only did legendary and mythical characters like Lancelot get absorbed into the story to make it popular, so did ancient gods and goddesses and mythical creatures. And there was an ancient Celtic goddess called Gwenhwyvar, which means white lady. And she was a goddess who became mortal. And it's probable that the story of Guinevere the goddess, who basically her job on earth was to go around seducing kings or seducing the best friends of kings to get them to create discord and warfare. So the idea that Guinevere comes along causes a rift between Arthur and his right-hand man Lancelot, and the whole thing ends up in, well, chaos. That fits in with what this goddess Guinevere was supposed to go around doing in mortal form, setting people against each other. Apparently, she didn't do it for evil purposes. She did it to put them through a period of strife, so that they'd come out the other end a stronger and better person. So basically, this Guinevere of the legend of the Middle Ages fits in exactly with the mythology of this Welsh goddess. So, yes, there is truth behind the story, but no, I don't think Arthur's wife was called Guinevere. Unfortunately, we don't have any records of what the wife of Owain Llanddwyn, the perhaps historical Arthur, was called, because back then, people didn't bother very much about the lineage of women. It's all about the men.
Mm-hmm. Well, did Arthur have any children?
Yes, he did. And this is what's fascinating, another fascinating element to it. According to these, as I say, genealogies, these are basically family trees of descendants of direct lines of succession that occurred in Britain, that people wrote down, preserved in monasteries, and now still survive in various museums. Now, according to the genealogies, Owain had a son called Cuniglesus, who ruled after his father had died, and then he had a son, and so on and so forth. And these genealogies basically take the direct line of descent from Owain Llanddwyn, the historical Arthur, all the way down to the Middle Ages, and then you've then got far more records from the medieval period to tell us exactly who was related to whom else. And you put these two lots together, the Dark Age genealogies and the medieval records, and you find out the direct descendants of Owain, Arthur, turn out to be the Spencer family, of whom Princess Diana was a member. And so she was a direct descendant of the historical Arthur. And now it is Princess Diana's son, William, who is second in line to the English throne. After Charles, he will become king. And so, interestingly, we may have a king on the throne in Britain in the not-too-distant future who is, for the first time in centuries, directly descended from the historical Arthur. And what I find amazing is Arthur, according to legend, was born on Midsummer's Day. William was born on Midsummer's Day. His middle name is Arthur. So what a weird coincidence. And one of Merlin's prophecies, according to the medieval legend, is that Arthur will one day live again. But if you actually look into what was written in what was high British Latin, in other words, it's a ecclesiastical form of Latin used in the Middle Ages that was understood only really by monks. The direct translation isn't that Arthur will one day live again, but that his lineage will one day live again. So now we have Prince William, middle name Arthur, born on Midsummer's Day, and he will be our king in the not-too-distant future, perhaps. And, well, the lineage of Arthur will be re-established.
Wow. That's fascinating. Oh, my gosh. Well, who is the lady in the lake?
She is a fascinating character. In the Arthurian story, she is this strange nymph-like creature that lives in a lake. She's basically a kind of mermaid with legs. And you would imagine that the story of Excalibur is perhaps one of the most unbelievable aspects of the Arthurian legend, but it is something that, believe it or not, may be based on some historical event. Now, the story of the Lady of the Lake is that she is the one that gives Arthur Excalibur. Merlin knows the Lady of the Lake, knows that the lake she resides in, and he takes Arthur there as a young man, and the Lady of the Lake has forged this magic sword on an island that she lives on in the middle of the lake. She and Arthur gets the sword Excalibur. When ultimately he lies dying on the field of battle after his last battle at Camlan, he gives his sword Excalibur to one of his knights, who then throws it into the water of a nearby lake. And when he does so, the arm of the Lady of the Lake rises from the surface, grabs the weapon by the hilt, and takes it down into the crystal depths. Now, that's the legend. What's fascinating is that back at the time Arthur is said to have lived, 1,500 years ago, there was a Celtic tradition that during a chieftain's funeral, their prized possession, usually their sword, was thrown into a sacred pool or lake as an offering to a water goddess. Now, this could have been what was written into the original account, and then later in the Middle Ages, when they'd forgotten all about ancient Celtic traditions, had been turned into this fairy tale of this nymph grabbing the sword. And the reason I am convinced that the story did arise with this funeral tradition is that in the Arthurian story, the Lady of the Lake is called Vivian, and the name of this goddess to whom the Celts threw sacred weapons into lakes was called Viviana. Viviana, Vivian, it has to be the same person. So I think that explains how the Lady of the Lake story came about.
Wow. Since you said that, like I told you, my father's name is Berlin, Verlin. He has a sister named Vivian.
You're joking? Huh?
No.
Well, Merlin and Vivian.
Oh my gosh.
The really interesting thing is that in all the medieval romances, I mean, we haven't got any historical records to prove this, But in all the medieval romances, Vivian and Merlin have an affair. They're basically a couple. So that, I mean, the Lady of the Lake was later given other names. But the original name that she is given is Vivian, and Merlin and Vivian are basically an item.
Wow. In my family, it's my dad and my aunt. Oh my gosh.
Well, it's still pretty interesting. That's a weird coincidence.
That is. That I would have never put those two together until you just said it. Wow. Okay. Let me try to focus again. What does the Holy Grail have to do with the whole story of Arthur?
The Holy Grail. This is the traditional story of the Holy Grail, as was written in around about the year 1200 by a French author by the name of Robert de Boron. Now you might think, how come French people are always writing about this stuff? Well, it wasn't so much that they were French, i.e. they came from France, although they may have done. In this case, Robert de Boron came from Burgundy. Remember that, well, for people in America, they probably won't realize that from 1066, England was ruled by the French. England was part of the French Empire, so to speak. It was invaded by a man called William the Conqueror, William I of England, in 1066, and he replaced all the Anglo-Saxons, remember, had invaded Britain, and Arthur was one of the last people to fight against them, him being the Celts. The Anglo-Saxons invaded. They founded what is now England, Angleland, pushed the native Celts into what is now Wales, which is in the west of Britain. And then later, in 1066, the French, or the Normans from northern France, all invaded all of England and also Wales. So it then became a completely new lot of people who were ruling the country. And all the Anglo-Saxon barons and lords were replaced by French ones. And so upper crust of society, people who were educated and who could read and write, if they were in the church, they'd write in Latin, or if they were writing a secular way, they would write in French. So hence is why all these writers about the Arthurian romances, a lot of them were French and wrote in French. Anyway, Robert de Boron, he wrote a story about the Holy Grail and its association with Arthur. The Grail is said to have been this cup used by Jesus at the Last Supper, according to the Bible. This cup, it is said, was then obtained by one of Jesus' followers, a man called Joseph of Arimathea, who used it to collect a few drops of Christ's blood while he was on the cross during the crucifixion. Now, that then imbued this cup with miraculous healing properties. You could drink from it and be cured of all ills, and in some legends live forever. Jesus had died, the disciples were persecuted by the Romans, and according to the story of Robert de Boron, Joseph of Arimathea brought the cup to Britain. Now, why Britain, you may ask? Well, at the time that Jesus lived, the Roman Empire was massive, covered most of what's now Western Europe, but they hadn't yet invaded Britain. So it was an outpost where Christians, for example, were not going to be persecuted. So Joseph of Arimathea came to Britain, according to the legend, to found a church here, brought this cup with him, hid it somewhere, and many years later, when Arthur's on the throne, he falls ill, and Merlin organizes a quest by the Knights of the Round Table to go in search of this holy item, the Holy Grail, as it was called, this cup that had contained the blood of Christ, so that Arthur could drink from it and be healed. After many adventures, one of the knights, sometimes portrayed as Percival, other times as Gawain, but he finds the cup, brings it back to Arthur. Arthur drinks from it. He's cured. Merlin then orders that the cup is hidden again. And it's said to be hidden in somewhere called the White Castle in the White Land. Now, that is the story of the Holy Grail as it was written around about the year 1200 by this poet Robert de Baron.
Okay. Well, what about the Knights of the Round Table and the Round Table? Is that any historical fact to that, or is that all legend also?
The Round Table, there's actually a place in England that you can go and see the Round Table actually on the wall. It's about 18 feet in diameter, and it looks like an enormous dartboard for playing darts. Do they play darts in America?
Oh yeah, I was really good at it back when I was younger.
Oh right, okay, well cool. It's like an enormous dartboard, but it's laid out in segments of different colours with the names of Arthur's knights written at the places where they're supposed to have sat. And then there's a painting of a king where Arthur would have sat. Now, it's said that this was the original Round Table, and it's at Winchester Great Hall, part of what was Winchester Castle, which is in the south of England, which was, during the Middle Ages, the capital of Britain for a while. London wasn't before it, and London became it afterwards, but for a while, Winchester was the seat of government. And in the Great Hall, which was once the seat of government for Britain, or at least England, there is this Round Table. And it now hangs on the wall, as I say, like an enormous dartboard, but it was once the tabletop with legs. For years, this has always been shown to tourists as the original Round Table, which is what you're told today if you go and visit there. But the paint was analysed. Well, when you look at the paint, you know full well that this doesn't go back to the year 500 when Arthur is said to have lived. It's a medieval painting. In fact, the king depicted on it is Henry VIII, and he lived in the 1500s. So Henry VIII probably had this thing painted with himself on it, kind of making himself like, well, I'm your modern Arthur. But radiocarbon dating was performed on the table a few years ago, and it was able to, that's how you can date how old organic matter is, like wood. And they were able to date that it was probably made during the 1300s. It doesn't go back much earlier than that. So this is a fake. This isn't your actual Round Table. This was probably made by some English king at the time when he thought, well, you know, everybody's loving the Arthurian romances. The Arthurian romances in the Middle Ages was something similar to what Game of Thrones is today. Everybody was into it. So I can imagine that some king somewhere in the world might one day make one of those thrones that's the main throne in Game of Thrones. Well, in the same way, somebody decided to create a Round Table, one of the kings of England in the Middle Ages. But this was hundreds of years after the time Arthur is said to have lived. But where the story of the Round Table may come from is that Celtic warriors, when they met, the idea of the Round Table, as it's explained in the Middle Ages, is that it was to give a sense of equality. It wasn't a rectangular or square table where someone could sit at the head. It was round, so everyone was equal. All knights enjoyed equal authority around the table. The Celts had a tradition that the Celtic warriors, the chieftain and their warriors, would sit in a circle around a cauldron from which they would all share the same soup or broth and all drink from the same cup as they passed it around. The idea was it proved that they trusted each other. So if anyone was going to poison them, well, they'd all die. So this sitting in a circle during important meetings of a tribal chief or king and their main warriors, them sitting in a circle may have been what was behind the legend of Arthur's Round Table. And then in the Middle Ages, somebody decided to actually make a table to fit in with the legend.
Well, how did knights become knights at that time period?
Well, in the way that the story is set in the Middle Ages is you've got the knights all in this heavy plate armor, which wasn't invented until around about the year 1200. Before that, they didn't have this heavy armor. Armor was like chainmail and leather, thick leather. This heavy plate armor didn't exist. The kind of castles that are found in the Arthurian stories, these huge Gothic castles with turrets and battlements, they didn't exist either. So going back to the year 500, when Arthur seems to have really existed, people would have worn Roman-style armor, and they wouldn't have lived in huge, cold Gothic castles, but the best of them would have lived in Roman-style villas, and the fortifications wouldn't have been great big battlemented walls made of stone, but wooden stockades. Now, why, you may ask, is the story of Arthur portrayed in this setting of knights in armor and big cold Gothic castles? The reason is that during the Middle Ages, when those stories were written, nobody knew what Romans had looked like. It's only really more modern times, archaeology and so forth, that has told us what Romans really looked like, or people from the late Roman era, and how they lived. So what the medieval authors did was to set the story in their own historical context, which is why, incidentally, if you see medieval paintings of the crucifixion of Jesus, you will see the Roman soldiers standing at the foot of the cross, all dressed like medieval knights, because people had no idea what Roman soldiers were supposed to look like. So this idea of knights and shining armor and everything is completely a medieval context. And the reason that they did this is simply because they didn't know what people were really supposed to look like. So, were there such things as knights back in Arthur's time? No, there wasn't. But there would have been chief warriors, and in the Middle Ages, they called such people knights.
Well, did the people understand that the buildings that they were living in, a lot of them, and towns or villages, were built by the Romans, or did they actually believe that they built them, or their ancestry built them?
The Roman Empire itself broke into two in the 300s, with Rome, the capital of the Western Empire, and Constantinople, now Istanbul, the capital of the Eastern Empire. Now, the Eastern Empire actually carried on until the mid-1400s in one form or another, where it became known as the Byzantine Empire. But as for the Roman Empire in the West, that started to collapse in the 400s. And in the year 410, Rome was actually sacked by the Germanic tribes, the Visigoths. The edge of the Roman Empire, if you like, its eastern flank, its eastern front, was designated by the rivers Rhine and Danube. And the people who lived to the east of that were the Germanic tribes, people from areas such as Germany and Austria, Switzerland, the Germanic-speaking world. And there were many tribes, the Goths, separated into the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, which means Western and Eastern Goths. And there's many others. The Anglo-Saxons, for example, that eventually invaded Britain, were a Germanic tribe that fell outside the Roman Empire. But through the 400s, because the empire had split into two, the Western Empire was the weaker of the two, and they began to fall prey to invasions from these Germanic tribes east of the Rhine. And in 410 AD, Rome itself was besieged by the tribe, the Visigoths, and the emperor managed to flee to a nearby town of Ravenna, where he set up an alternative capital for a while. But he needed to retake Rome, and he needed all the legions he could get. And one of the legions that was standing by idly doing nothing was the one that, the last of the legions that maintained law and order in the Roman province of Britannia, Britain. So he called them back. The Emperor Honorius said, "You're right, sent message, you've got to come back and help defend Rome." And they managed to retake Rome. But it depleted Britain of its soldiers. It depleted Britain, basically, of its law and order keeping forces. And from 410 AD, that's the end of Roman Britain officially. It was still supposed to be part of the Roman Empire, but, well, there was no troops to keep law and order. The Roman Empire in the West struggled on until the 470s, when it eventually collapsed completely, and the last Roman emperor, by the name of Romulus Augustulus, who was actually just a boy. It was his father, a general, his uncle, a general, who really ruled the empire. But after 476, I think it was, there was no longer a Roman Empire in the West. But Roman civilization had continued in Britain, mainly in the old Roman towns where commerce carried on. People managed to get their own militias together to run their own towns, and there was a sort of there's evidence from archaeology that was a continuation of Roman administration. And it was during this time that people in the towns continued to follow Roman religion. Now, at the end of the Roman Empire, the Romans had become Christians. So in towns, there was Christianity still being practiced. But outside the towns, the Celtic people had quickly reverted to their old tribal allegiances and religious beliefs, paganism, if you like. And strangely, the word pagan comes from this time. It comes from the Latin word pagus, which means country dweller. So pagan religion is the religion of the country people, as opposed to the Roman Catholic Christian religion of the Roman dwellers in the towns. The word heathen, incidentally, means the same thing. Dweller on the heath. And a heath was an area of open countryside. So people in the cities, still living a Roman-style life, suddenly became very, very different from the people of the countryside who were leading a pagan life. And gradually, as the 400s went on, more and more of these Roman towns collapsed. They hadn't got the soldiers properly trained to defend them for a start, and there were easy pickings to these pagans coming in from the countryside and pillaging the place and eventually taking over. And Britain ended up dividing into a whole set of separate kingdoms, of which Viriconium was the capital of the central kingdom of Powys, as it was called at the time. But somehow around the end of the 400s, whoever it was who was ruling from Viriconium, we know first it was this man called Ambrosius, who may have become the historical Merlin, and following him, Owain Llanddwyn, became the historical Arthur. They managed to form an alliance of all these other tribes, and in a sense became the last kings of a united Britain, or the last emperors of the last vestige of the Roman Empire, if you like. But after Arthur's death, all that fell apart, and the Anglo-Saxons were under the offensive again and eventually took over. So by Arthur's time, did people still know that Romans had built the cities? Probably where he was, at Viriconium, but most people in the countryside by this time were probably thinking about the Roman towns and cities of being ruins of some ancient mythical civilization that may have been ruled by demigods. So, yes, Arthur would have known, and his warriors and the people that were still following him, but there were many parts of the country in which they'd completely forgotten about whoever the Romans were.
Well, does Stonehenge or the standing stones have anything to do with the either legend of Arthur or the historical facts of Arthur?
Sorry, I didn't get the first bit. The what? What did you say there?
I said Stonehenge or the standing stones, do they have any basis within the legends or facts of Arthur's time?
Yes, it's historically Stonehenge was built around about 5,000 years ago, way before the historical period of Arthur and Merlin. But legend says that it was Merlin who actually built Stonehenge. It is said, these were stories that were written in the Middle Ages. It's said that Merlin somehow magically transported the stones that make up Stonehenge from Ireland. And it was known at the time as the Giant's Dance. And the reason is they were supposed to be giants who had danced in a circle somewhere performing some diabolical satanic rite. And some magician, maybe Merlin, maybe one of his predecessors, had turned all these giants to stone. And Merlin decided to bring them to Britain for some reason. Okay, that's probably, well, I would say that's pretty much certainly just made up. But it's not made up from nothing. We now know archaeologically that the stones of Stonehenge did come from somewhere else. They didn't come from Ireland, but they came from South Wales, about 140 miles away in a direct straight line from Stonehenge. The huge stones that make up Stonehenge once made up a similar monument 140 miles away in South Wales. And back in 3000 BC, the ancient Britons somehow managed to drag these stones either on rollers or on skis, if it happened to be snow, or perhaps put them on barges and then floated them down through the sea and then up various rivers until they could get within about 20 miles of Stonehenge and then drag them across countryside. But this mammoth undertaking to move these huge stones all the way from somewhere else to Stonehenge obviously lived on as a legend that the stones of Stonehenge were once somewhere else and they came here to where they are now in southern England. And then Merlin becomes associated with the legend as being the famous magician who managed to move them here. Now, why was Merlin associated with it? Well, remember that I said that Merlin was a title, meaning the eagle, and that his real name was Ambrosius, and that, as I said, there was this historical figure called Ambrosius Aurelius, who did exist as an important warrior and later advisor to the king at the time Arthur is said to have lived. Right next to Stonehenge, within a couple of miles, its nearest little town is called Amesbury, which basically comes from the Old English meaning town of Ambrosius. So the place that Ambrosius came from, the one who's to become the historical Merlin, seems to have been right next to where Stonehenge is. So once again, you've got a whole set of what seems to be a mythological story, a fanciful tale with no basis in historical fact. But when you look into it, you see how, like Chinese whispers, over the years, the story can change from an historical set of circumstances to the legend they became. Yes, the stones were moved there from somewhere else, And yes, Merlin was associated with the area.
Wow. Well, what about the standing stones?
Do you mean what were they for?
Yeah, what were they used for?
Well, they weren't giants turned to stone. I mean, interesting again, you have another folk tale which can reveal something about Stonehenge. Throughout Britain, there are, I think, around 1,300 stone circles that still survive. There would have been many more than that going back thousands of years. Stonehenge is just the most famous of them. It is the most famous because it's got those lintel stones, the stones that join them, the standing stones together in a series of rectangular arches. There's no other stone circle that actually has those. But it's by far not the biggest. The largest, I mean, Stonehenge is a couple of hundred, I think it's 300 feet across, maybe a bit less, I can't remember off the top of my head. But there's a stone circle about 20 miles to the north called the Avebury Stone Circle, which is half a mile in diameter. Quarter of a mile in diameter. And it's pretty big. And consists of much bigger and many more stones than Stonehenge. So Stonehenge wasn't the biggest. It's the most elaborate because of its arches. But there were many even smaller stone circles built throughout the country. The average height of the stones perhaps being between 4 to 6 feet, and there being around 20 stones in each circle. The diameters varying, but the average is probably around 40 feet. So you've got all these stone circles throughout the country, and what were they used for? Well, unfortunately, at the time they were built, it really was prehistoric times because no one was writing historical records. There was no form of writing in Britain. The people who built these things were still living in the Stone Age. They were using Stone Age implements. In other words, flint axes, antlers from stags as pickaxes. They were carrying the rubble away in wickerwork baskets. It took, imagine hacking these stones, some of
Hello?
the bedrock. Yes, can you hear me?
I can now.
Hello?
I lost you there for a second.
I was just saying that it would have taken an awful lot to hack these stones out of the bedrock using nothing but animal antlers and flint axes, but they did it, and they managed to transport these stones and then get them into an upright position. So these were very important to them, but why were they doing it? Well, there's a legend about Stonehenge. Outside the main circle of stones, there's a single standing stone, pretty big, about, 10, 12 feet high, and it's known as the heel stone. And the reason it's called that is that there's a legend concerning a friar, in other words, a priest, as in Friar Tuck, a friar, a priest, a wandering priest, who tried to exorcise the devil from the middle of Stonehenge. Now, Christians in the Middle Ages often associated stone circles with places of paganism and devil worship, and Stonehenge had this legend associated with it, that the devil lived in it. And according to another legend, this friar, this priest, turns up, tries to exorcise the devil, fails, the devil gets really mad, picks up one of the standing stones, hurls it after the friar, and it just misses him, hitting him on the heel. And so this stone, which is about 100 feet away from the main stone circle that stands on its own, was known as the Friar's Heel, or because it hit.
Hello?
Interesting tale. But how did this story of the Friar's Heel come about? Well, the Friar's Heel stone, if you translate Friar's Heel or Frios Hill back into Celtic, you get the words rising sun. In other words, it was originally called the Rising Sunstone, Frios Hill, and then somebody later who didn't speak the original language thought, Frios Hill, why is it called that? And hence the story of this the stone, because on midsummer's sunrise, on the midsummer solstice, around the 21st of June, when the sun rises, as viewed from the center of the stone circle, it rises directly over the heel stone. And so many other stone circles have these single standing stones outside the main ring, which align with the midwinter or midsummer sunrise or sunset. So it seems that these temples were probably originally places of sun worship.
Okay. Well, I know this question is going to be a little bit off topic, but why do Christians dislike the pagans so much?
Wow, that's a big, deep philosophical question. I suppose it goes back to why do all religions dislike other religions? The interesting thing about Christianity and paganism is that going back to ancient times, going back to the time of the Roman Empire, Christianity was started off by Jesus and his followers, according to the Bible, in and around Jerusalem. But it wasn't, it started off as another form of Judaism. But they started to spread the word, and it began to take root in parts of what once had been part of the Greek Empire in southern Turkey. Taken over by the Romans, all now part of the Roman Empire. And it began to, everyone was equal. And so it appealed to two lots of people that were completely left outside of normal religion. I mean, there were many religions in the Roman world. There were religions that were adopted from Egypt, like the worship of Isis, and from Persia, the worship of a god Mithras that was worshipped by soldiers. You got the main god in Rome, which was Sol Invictus, or the sun god, and so on. But what two groups of people who were completely, really excluded, except for in a few cases, from religious life were slaves. Woman. In fact, in the arena, when people went there to watch entertainment of chariot races, gladiator fights, and whatnot, women had to sit at the very back, unless you were of very high status, like the emperor's wife or something. So, but women and slaves were completely excluded from religion, and they made up well over half the population of the Roman Empire. So, consequently, this new religion of Christianity says, yeah, you can all be part of this, women could even be priests in those days in early Christianity. So it very quickly started taking off in places that, the Greek world in particular, which was then Greece and what's now Turkey mainly, and those areas had once been the most sophisticated power in the world, and they'd been taken over by the Romans, so they weren't very happy. So when this new religion came along to say, everyone's equal, it kind of appealed to many of the Greek world. In 70 AD, the Jews in Jerusalem revolted, and there was repercussions were that hundreds of thousands of them were slaughtered. The main temple in Jerusalem was razed to the ground, all by the Emperor Vespasian, who basically pretty much caused tremendous trouble for Judaism in and around Jerusalem. And the Christians that were there, this offshoot of Judaism started by Jesus, they were either wiped out completely in what is now Israel, or they moved somewhere else. And it left the Christian church that had been established in the Greek world to grow. And we know this from the New Testament, the writings of St. Paul, where he writes to Christian communities in Corinth, in Greece, and Ephesus in Turkey, and even in Rome. And so, hence, in the New Testament, you've got these books, Paul's letters to the Romans, the Corinthians, the Ephesians, and so on. So this new religion that began Christianity in Jerusalem changed. It started taking on Greek aspects to it. Now, so right from the beginning, Christianity was a religion that learned to absorb the customs of I won't go on too much about that, but I'll fast forward now to the period of the when the Roman Empire decided to adopt Christianity. At first, Christians were persecuted in the Roman Empire, but in the year 325, the Roman Empire, under the leadership of Constantine the Great, Constantine I, accepted Christianity as the state religion of the Roman Empire. There's a whole series of reasons why this was done, but it meant that this new form of Roman Catholicism, as it was called, the Catholic Church or Universal Church, had to adopt a whole host of Roman traditions into its belief system. And these included the dates when people, important dates of worship. One of the most important dates in the Roman calendar was the midwinter festival of Sol Invictus. This was when the sun god was worshipped in the middle of winter, and it just so happened that fell on the 25th of December. So the Roman Catholic Church adopted that same date as the traditional date of the birth of Jesus, although in the Bible it doesn't tell us when in the year he was born. You've got other people in the Roman Empire who worshipped various religions, all held the beginning of the year as being very important. Now, in the ancient world, the year began on or around the 21st of March, which is the equinox, when day and night are of equal length, when the sun is directly overhead at the equator, in other words. Because they had to divide the year into months or phases of the moon, that's where the word month comes from, moons, they started the year on the first full moon after the 21st of March each year. And that was called, in the Celtic world, the festival of Estra, or Oestra, depending on what part of the world you came from. And so the Christians decided, right, we'll still have that same date, but this time to commemorate Jesus' death and rebirth. And that's why it's called Easter, after what had been called the festival of Estra. And it is still, even today, the reason why Easter Day keeps changing every year is because it is the nearest Sunday, or the first Sunday after, the first full moon following the 21st of March. So you've got lots and lots of these pagan traditions getting involved in Christianity. And by the Middle Ages, you've got all sorts of pagan traditions involved. In Norse mythology, people used to bring trees, fir trees, indoors and decorate them to honor the god Odin. People throughout Europe began to sort of bring trees indoors at Christmas to honor Jesus, Christmas trees. And because you've got there were so many pagan elements within Christianity, it wasn't really until the later Middle Ages that the church began to say, hold on, we've got to start changing a lot of this. We don't want people to start thinking that we are actually Christianity is something partly made up of pagan religion, and hence anybody who started drawing attention to the fact that, hold on, Christmas trees, that's pagan. Hold on, Christmas Day is pagan. So is Easter. They started to eradicate these people as heretics, and hence the Inquisition was born to root out heresy, that people going around questioning that Christianity had any pagan influences in it. So consequently, in short, the answer to your questions is the reason why Christianity hated pagans is because Christianity was in part based on paganism, and they didn't like the fact.
Wow. That's so true. Well, I'll get one more question in before I let you go, because I know it's, well, in your part of the woods, it's getting earlier, and it's getting later here.
Oh, well, it is. The sun, well, the sun hasn't come up yet, but I can see people starting to go to work.
Well, what can you tell us about the legend, that states that Arthur will remain sleeping until foreign invaders threaten Britain once again?
Yeah, the original story is that he is buried in a secret location, and he will rise again one day when Britain is in greatest need. Now, the location where I think that he's buried, as I say, we've done archaeological geophysics scans, and we know there is a grave there. If we dug it up, we may be able to prove that this was Arthur. There might be something buried with him, that this man was called the Bear. He may just have his name, Owen Van Gwyn, inscribed on something. One way or the other, that is very unlikely. So you dig up somebody, and all they'd basically say, well, this was a warrior called Owen Van Gwyn, maybe because it's where he's supposed to be buried. I don't believe it's King Arthur. So there's not a lot to be gained from digging it up. Unfortunately, I've tried to get a dig to take place there, and the county archaeologists are all on side. But English Heritage, which is the department in Britain or in England that decides upon what archaeological excavations can be carried out at protected sites, which this is, have said no. Now, they haven't said no because they don't believe there's something down there, because their own archaeologists have said, yes, there's something there, whether it's Arthur or not. We've got a 1,500-year-old king buried down here. Be interesting to see what it looks like and, what he's buried with. Or it might be a queen, actually, for all we know, but my research suggested it is this man Owen. And they say, well, we don't really want to start disturbing the ground, because the type of soil it's in means that it's not a solid skeleton down there. The bones have turned into basically a different type of soil. So it needs very careful archaeological excavation to reveal the outline of where bones were in different coloured soil. And the shield that was buried with this person will have completely rotted away. It's just a different colour of the soil that can tell us where it was. We know there's a metal central boss down there, the middle bit of a shield. But until archaeology has advanced a little bit further, English Heritage think it could be too destructive and detrimental to try and excavate that tomb at the moment, or that grave. So nothing's happening just yet. So Arthur, historically, is still resting at peace. Remember I said that the original story about Arthur is that it wasn't so much him that was going to be resurrected one day and come back to life, but that it was going to be one of his descendants. Well, if that is Prince William, as I was talking about earlier, when he comes to the throne, it will be a very interesting thing to see if it coincides with the period when English Heritage say, okay, you can dig up that tomb now. So that's my take on all that.
So that would be amazing. I hope I'm alive to see that happen. That would be great. Well, sir, I want to appreciate you coming on the show. What are your plans for the rest of 2019? And do you have any projects you're working on that you can discuss?
Well, there's the book about Stonehenge that I've got coming out in June. My American publishers at Inner Traditions are publishing that in, I think it's the 11th of June. That's all about not just Stonehenge, but all the various stone circles throughout Britain, what they may have been used for. I've mentioned a little bit about them tonight, but all about the stone circles, who built them, why they were built. That book's going to be called the Wisdom Keepers of Stonehenge, because it's all about the people who built it and what they were and what they believed. I'm also writing another book, which is all about it's a Victorian mystery about a woman who disappeared following a fire in 1896. This woman led some strange mystical organization, similar to a female Masonic group. She was a famous pre-Raphaelite model. She was also a leader of quite a large cult. She had quite a following of people who believed in the occult. And then she strangely disappeared in this fire that broke out in a Victorian mansion during a seance in 1896. And it's what became of this lady and what caused the fire. And so I'm two separate books. One's written, coming out in June, about Stonehenge, and the other one, I don't know what I'm going to call it yet, but it's about the strange fate of a lady Victorian occultist.
Wow. Well, do you have a website or anywhere that people can go if they have any, questions or comments, or how can they get a copy of your books?
Yes, by all means. My website is Graham Phillips, GrahamPhillips, Graham Phillips at Hotmail. No, hold on, that's my. Hold on, how do I do it? Yeah, GrahamPhillips.net. So I was getting confused with my email then. Graham Phillips, all one word, .net is my Facebook. I mean, if you forget that, just write Graham Phillips author into Google search and you'll come up with my website. The reason I put author on the end of it is that there's another famous Graham Phillips who's an American actor who went out with Ariana Grande at one point, and I quite often get fan mail to him. But I'll just pass it on. I haven't actually got anything from Ariana Grande yet, but I can look forward to that, hopefully. But, GrahamPhillips.net. And if you go on the first page, the main page, there are pictures of all of my books. And if you click on one of those, the whole story about all those books is there, complete with pictures, all illustrations and so on, maps. And unlike some authors who only put a tantalizing little bit on their website, you haven't got the whole story, and you have to buy the book for that. You don't have to buy my books if you don't want to. You can just read through the whole thing and the whole explanation about what all my books are, the whole argument, plus pictures and photographs. It's all there for anyone to see. And on the front page also is the link to my Facebook, and anyone is welcome to join. Hello? 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 Oh.
That's it for us tonight. I want to thank everyone that took the time to listen in. I'd like to give a big shout out to the Vibe Radio Network and to Ryan for putting up with us. Also to all the first responders and our men and women in the armed services, thank you for your service and the sacrifices that you and your families make every day to keep our great nation safe. Tune in next week to another exciting show starting at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Everyone can go to our Facebook page Within the Chaos, and don't forget to like our page to see upcoming guests along with past shows, postings, or you can also go to my website at www.blackdiamondps.org or blogtalkradio.com/Vibe Radio Network. Also, we have a YouTube channel, so go to YouTube, look up Within the Chaos for past shows. Thanks again. Until next week, everyone have a safe weekend and have a good night. And love you all. Be careful out there.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world, millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people. To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. Soldiers, don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think, or what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men, machine men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are not cattle, you are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate, only the unloved hate, the unloved and the unnatural. Soldiers, Don't fight for slavery, fight for liberty. In the 17th chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you. You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world, that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!